Hello, you're very welcome. I'm Hermione Lee, and it's my pleasant duty to tell you before I introduce tonight's speaker that there are drinks afterwards in the cafe, and you're very welcome to join us. I'm very pleased today to introduce Clare Carlisle. She's a distinguished professor of philosophy at King's College London, who up to now, or up to recently, was known for her work mainly on Spinoza and Kierkegaard. Her book on him, Philosopher of the Heart, The Restless Life of Søren Kierkegaard, came out in 2019. But she's now taken on another life, or a double life, with her much acclaimed new biography, or fairly new, last year, isn't it? Of George Eliot, which follows on from her edition of George Eliot's translation of Spinoza's Ethics. Her book is not at all a traditional biography, though it does get deep inside the story of George Eliot's life and work. It comes at George Eliot in large part through her knowledge and her reading of philosophy, which was such an important part of her intellectual life and so powerfully informed her novels, not only Spinoza but also Goethe, Feuerbach, Comte, Spencer, Hegel, and indeed Kierkegaard. But if that sounds daunting to those of you like me in the audience who are not philosophers, it isn't. It's clarifying and it's absorbing and it's illuminating. And the emphasis on philosophy is yoked to a fascinating exploration of the question of marriage in George Eliot's life and in her fiction. Ambitiously, Clare Carlisle's book investigates George Eliot's real and fictional marriages, or I should say marriages in inverted commas, as a way into her philosophy of life, arguing that, I quote, marriage is rarely treated as a philosophical question. So I'm very eager to hear her talk about this very original approach to a great writer, in particular in relation to and in parallel with Kierkegaard. And after the talk, I and we will have a chance to ask a few questions. So please make Clare Carlisle very welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Hermione, for the lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming this evening. So I am going to be talking a bit about Kierkegaard and George Eliot and my biographies of both, although that's not my title. The title is Life as a Whole, and this is part of a new project that I've been working on since finishing the biography of George Eliot last year. And so I've been thinking, I guess, perhaps in a more theoretical way about life writing and thinking philosophically about it, having had this experience of writing two biographies. So the talk I'm going to give is drawing on this relatively new, in fact, in progress work. So philosophical questions, I've discovered, pulse through biography. What is the shape, purpose, value, and meaning of a human life? How much freedom did it have? How much responsibility for its path through the world? Which parts or aspects of a life are most important? What kind of truth is to be discovered in or drawn from a human life? And how might writing transmit this truth? Even more fundamentally, what is a human life? For that is typically a biographer's subject matter and her guiding concept, one whole life from birth to death. This is, I think, significantly distinct from adjacent concepts such as person, human being, individual, self, and soul. So the concept of one whole life is not quite the same as these other concepts, I think. Life writing brings this concept into view while revealing it to be both epistemically and metaphysically elusive. Today I'm going to approach it by way of a reflection on writing, beginning with a childhood memory. This is me when I was a little girl. When I was a little girl, before I started school, my mother taught me to write. First, I learned to write the alphabet with a pencil on lined paper. Letters were a mixture of curved and straight lines, An A was quite difficult. You began to draw a circle, but you didn't make it a whole circle, and then you put a straight vertical line on the right-hand side of it. A B was a tall letter made out of a straight vertical line, twice the height of the A, but on the left side. The lined paper helped me to get the proportions right. C was an easy letter, although, as with the A, it was important to make sure the gap in the circle was neither too large nor too small. When I wrote my name, I had to draw a C as tall as a B. We used to call it a big C, but later I learned that this was a capital letter. On reaching G, you faced a new challenge. You had to begin like an A and then extend the straight line downwards towards the line below, but before you touched that line, you curved to the left and then up a bit, but not too much, to make a tail. My mother's writing was round, clear, flowing, very beautiful. She could join all the letters in each word together. I tried to make my letters more beautiful, like hers. I tried hard not to make any mistakes. At some point in childhood, the act of writing became so habitual that I no longer thought about it. Even as a philosophy student and eventually a philosophy professor, writing almost every day, I hardly paused to wonder, what is writing? What are we doing when we write? Recollecting the experience of learning to write, a memory I imagine most of you share, helps to lift the veil of habit that usually shrouds the act of writing. There was a time for all of us when the combined physical and mental effort of drawing letters and putting them together to form words and sentences required our full attention. When we bring our attention back to writing... Oh. Sorry? Shall I?
You just need that one, perhaps.
Yeah.
It's banging your jumper.
Oh, right. Sorry about that.
So try that.
When we bring our attention back to writing, we discover that it resembles life. Writing a text means drawing a certain line on a page. Living a life means drawing a certain line through the world. These lines move through space and through time. A path seems to be a fitting metaphor for writing as well as for life. In each case, one must find or make a path, move in a singular shape through terrain that is absolutely teeming with possibilities. So many combinations of letters and words, so many people to meet and places to go. And yet the path of writing, like the path of life, can quickly acquire a trajectory that draws us onward with a force that may feel irresistible, even necessary. Sometimes our path is formed by following others who have gone before us. Sometimes it is formed by choices, a decision to go this way, not that way, over here, not over there. Every path is a combination of following and choosing whom to follow, and following others' choices. Every path is some combination of finding and making. Life is relational, and so is writing. It is the relationships between the words and then between sentences that make a meaningful text. These relationships are constituted by grammar, syntax, rhyme, assonance, repetition. For example, repeating a name creates a relationship of identity. The line of writing, like the line of living, has an intermittent and rhythmic quality. On paper, there are spaces between letters and between words, just as in our bodies there are spaces between breaths, between heartbeats, between footsteps. Subjectively, in the field of conscious experience, there are longer intermittencies of sleeping and waking and irregular intermittencies as attention lapses and returns. Underlying these stops and starts is a flow, such as the flow of blood through the body and the flow of thought, unconscious as well as conscious, that underlies the act of writing. A piece of writing, like a living being, has a rhythm, and its rhythm is essential to its structure, how it moves, and its texture, how it feels. Inseparable from this rhythm is temporality, which is difficult to think about, let alone understand. As soon as a text comes into being, whether it's finished or still being written, it is there all at once on the page. Yet writing and reading are active, imaginative experiences that unfold in time, bringing the text into being and sustaining it in being, just as a footpath through the countryside is formed and renewed by each person or animal who walks along it. Similarly, we can distinguish these two aspects of a human life. It is a dynamic shape unfolding in time, moment by moment, and it is a shape that exists all at once. The idea of a whole life, the idea of a whole life is an image that transcends the life itself, like an aerial view of a great river from its source to the sea, seen from miles above the earth. A whole life, seen as a whole, is an image transcending the flow of time. Indeed, it is an image of time, an idea in the mind of God, seen under the aspect of eternity, as Spinoza put it. When we imagine it this way, it becomes something very beautiful. A whole life moving through the world from its source to its end, unique, slender, fragile, searching. A God looking down on it may well be moved to love, and also perhaps to tears. In writing, as in life, linearity combines with complexity. On the one hand, the line of writing is unidirectional. It only moves forwards from beginning to end, from left to right or from right to left. On the other hand, yet at the same time, the line of writing loops, folds, gathers, knots, stitches itself together, forming layers. For example, a recurring metaphor, a rhyme, or a repeated word tack one point in the line to another. A text might come full circle, its end echoing its beginning. Life shares this double character. It flows irrevocably in one direction. We can't travel back in time. Yet our experience continually folds back and loops forward, in memory, in habit, in deliberate repetition, as in practice and rituals, in all the moods of anticipation, expectancy, waiting, hope, worry, dread, premonition, and in all the moods of looking back, regret, remorse, disappointment, grief, gratitude, affectionate remembrance, bittersweet nostalgia. Observing these similarities between writing and life brings them into a certain relation. Are we merely putting them in parallel, two lines that never touch one another? Is this a relation of mirroring, concerned only with resemblance? Is it a relation of analogy, in which the lines remain parallel, but yet we move back and forth between the two, a movement that extends our understanding of one or both of them? Or is there some other kind of relation between life and writing? Can they, do they, must they intersect, overlap, or coincide? Do they call out to one another? It seems straightforward to say that writing happens inside life. A piece of writing is a part of its author's life, and as it's read, it becomes part of the reader's life too. A text both needs this life and expresses it. This literary expression is not simply an emanation, it is reflexive, speaking not only from the writer's life, but in some way about that life. For the reader too, a text may speak not just to her, but also about her, about something in her inner or outer experience. When this happens, the writer's and reader's lives become part, but probably not the whole, of what is expressed in the writing. The life and the writing seem to somehow transcend one another. Each contains, exceeds, stretches beyond the other. So it seems that if we want to trace and reveal the shape of a whole life, then writing is a singularly appropriate way to do it. Form and content appear to suit one another. Writing is, in some deep ways, appropriate to life. With these observations in mind, let's now return to a question I raised earlier. What kind of truth can be discovered in or drawn from a human life, and how might writing transmit this truth? Adriana Cavarero, a feminist philosopher and literary scholar, explored life writing in her book Relating Narratives, Storytelling and Selfhood, which inspired Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novel My Brilliant Friend and its sequels. Relating Narratives begins with a tale from Karen Blixen's Out of Africa, about a man who is awakened in the night by a loud noise. He goes outside to investigate, running up and down in the dark, stumbling and falling, listening to the source of the noise. Eventually, he finds a leaky dike, sets to work, plugging the leak, then goes back to bed. The next morning, looking out of his window, he sees that his footsteps trace the shape of a stalk in the muddy ground. His nocturnal adventure, explains Cavarero, symbolises a whole life. Only afterwards, seen from the outside or from above, does its shape come into view. She draws from this parable the lesson that we cannot tell our own life story. Here, Cavarero echoes Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, who argued that the who, which appears so clearly and unmistakably to others, remains hidden from the person himself, like the daemon in Greek religion, which accompanies each man throughout his life, always looking over his shoulder from behind, and thus visible only to those he encounters. Arendt developed this thought in The Life of the Mind, her last work. Here she explored the distinction between appearance and reality that was visualized and dramatized in Plato's Cave in the Republic, and has run through the philosophical tradition ever since. Arendt was interested in the fact that, quote, all sense-endowed creatures have appearance as such in common. Appearing, she suggested, constitutes the unity of a life. To be alive means to live in a world that preceded one's own arrival and will survive one's departure. On this sheer level of being alive, appearance and disappearance as they follow upon each other are the primordial events which, as such, mark out time, the time span between birth and death. And I find this quite moving because Arendt gave this, these were her Gifford lectures, and it was right at the end of her life that she wrote this. Citing this text, Cavarero argues that for millennia, philosophy has diverted its gaze from the appearance of human beings because it cannot tolerate their most scandalous property, their realness, together with their contingency. Life writing is, she claims, antithetical to philosophy insofar as it examines the unique singularity of a life. Philosophy seeks general definitions. What is man, for example? Whereas the biographer asks, who is this man or who is this woman? Cavarero insists that the who question is always gendered. It's part of her feminist approach. Unlike philosophy, which has persisted in capturing the universal in the trap of definition, narration reveals the finite in its fragile uniqueness and sings its glory, writes Cavarero. This analysis does resonate with my own experience. Many philosophers, even those who specialize in the history of philosophy, are dismissive of questions they consider merely biographical. Writing biographies, working in a more narrative mode, did indeed give me an opportunity to think deeply about singular lives, an opportunity that seemed to be missing within the academic discipline of philosophy. So we might well turn to life writing for a critique of philosophy, perhaps a feminist critique of a patriarchal tradition, if we agree with Cavarero and Ferrante that this interest in one another's stories is a particularly feminine trait. But what if we saw life writing as full of philosophical potential, instead of setting it in opposition to philosophy? Considering it this way might stretch our ideas about what philosophy is and how it should be done, and it might also deepen our thinking about life writing. A Catholic philosopher called Eleanor Stump has argued that narrative, and in her case, biblical narrative, can enrich our understanding of suffering. So she wrote this book called Wandering in Darkness, and here she undertakes a close reading of the book of Job, a text, incidentally, with a biographical structure, beginning with Job's early adulthood and ending with his death, apparently 140 years later. Explaining her method, she draws a distinction between what she calls Dominican knowledge, the propositional kind of knowing deployed in modern analytic philosophy, which is her discipline, and Franciscan knowledge, by which she means knowledge of persons, knowledge of people. This Franciscan style, she explains, is more immediate and intuitive than propositional knowledge. It can arise, she says, in two different contexts. Second-person encounter, so basically meeting someone and getting to know them, and in literary narratives. Stump presents Franciscan knowledge as a valuable supplement to Dominican knowledge. Narratives are an aid to thinking through certain philosophical issues, she argues, while stressing that they are not a rival to philosophy itself. So while her pursuit of Franciscan knowledge seeks to expand philosophy beyond the rather narrow borders of her discipline, analytic philosophy, she does reinforce those borders by maintaining a clear distinction between a personal, intuitive kind of knowing and philosophy itself. Biography combines the two paradigmatic sources of Franciscan knowledge that Stump identifies, second-person encounter and narrative. And as the work of biography encounters its particular who in the medium of narrative, it might also encounter that elusive metaphysical entity that is one whole life. Although this entity is both the subject matter of most biographies and the presupposition of biography as a literary genre, it took shape for me as a philosophical question only as I was completing my first biography of Kierkegaard. This is, I think, this is the last sentence, actually, in that book, where I describe how, as I finished writing the book, I sensed the mysterious weight of a human life glimpsed in its entirety. Not long after this book came out, I read a lecture by a French philosopher called Etienne Souriau, titled On the Mode of Existence of the Work to be Made, which helped me to reflect on the nature of the biographical subject and the phenomenology of biographical work. Souriau's lecture, delivered in Paris in 1956, considers the practice of making that brings into being a work of art, any work of art, or of philosophy, in fact. The work to be made, l'œuvre à faire, refers to the phase of an artwork's existence before it's been finished, when the artist is contemplating it, imagining it, exploring it, living with it, in other words, in a poetic mode, bringing it into being. According to Souriau, the œuvre à faire has what he calls a virtual or spiritual existence, accompanied by a sort of halo of hope and wonder, which the artist intuits, responds to, and serves. This is both similar and dissimilar to a Platonic form, if that means something to you. Souriau describes the œuvre à faire as a spiritual form existing in a manner that is enigmatic and remote, but intense. It is demanding, it persistently asks to be created, summons the artist at all hours of the day and night to attend to it. In this creative labour, he says, there is always a measure of failure. However well it turns out, the finished artwork, the poem, painting, symphony, or whatever, will merely approximate the virtual work that the artist was seeking, pursuing, and serving. Souriau argues that the artist's responsive creative labour provides the only intimate, immediate, and direct experience we have at our disposal for inquiring into the existence of the work to be made. Analogously, it seems to me, the biographer's responsive creative labour in pursuit of a whole human life offers a chance of encountering this entity and inquiring into its being, even in his or her inevitable failure to grasp the whole life. A human life's mode of existence may well be different from that of Souriau's œuvre à faire, the work to be made. It arguably has more objectivity, while the œuvre à faire might be dismissed as just a figment of an artist's imagination. A life gathers many witnesses to its existence. While it never appears as a whole, a life makes manifold appearances in the world, this is what Hannah Arendt was pointing to, which account for the empirical element of biographical truth. Nevertheless, it resembles the work to be made in several ways. And this is not surprising, since Soriot embarks on his analysis of the oeuvre faire in order to illuminate the existence of any being whatsoever, including and perhaps especially our own selves. We all know, he told his audience in Paris, that each one of us is the sketch of a better, more beautiful, more grand, more intense, and more accomplished being, which requires a making. My sense is that he's probably quite influenced by Proust here. The biographical subject, the life as a whole, is a metaphysical or spiritual entity to which any life story will be merely an approximation. The life is elusive, transcendent, yet the biographer is responding to its call. While, in a sense, doomed to failure, this response is nevertheless an encounter that takes the form of an inquiry, a search, a pursuit. It also involves creativity. Just as the life's path through the world took shape through a combination of finding and making, so in the biographer's attempt to trace this path, their own poetic, imaginative and interpretative work becomes entwined with a process of discovery and verification. One whole life. I've said that this is elusive, but let me try to sketch the contours of the concept. A life is an event. It arises, it unfolds, it passes away. A life is a lifetime, a temporal entity, and it is a whole, the whole of which everything I do and experience, my childhood, my marriage, my work, an afternoon with a friend, is a part. A life can be named, Søren Kierkegaard or George Eliot, for example, though there is not one single name that indicates Eliot's life as a whole, as is the case for many women's lives. Once a life has ended and thus become whole in a final sense, it is invoked at the funeral under the banner of its name. None of the mourners has had access to this whole life, yet the collective gathering of witnesses to its many different aspects and phases is an approximation and symbol of its wholeness. The life story from cradle to grave will be told in an extremely abridged form, just a few minutes. This ritual of witness-bearing and storytelling traditionally takes place before a God who does see and know the whole life. The mourner's shared task is to carry the mystery that is or was this life and offer it to God, as if they were delivering a parcel, not knowing what's inside. And God, if he is there, receives it. The biographical subject exists, we might say, as an idea in the mind of God. Yet this seems unnecessarily idealist. Why specify its being as an idea in a mind? Better to say simply that it is in God or in nature. I think this is what Spinoza meant when he talked about the truth of finite things under the aspect of eternity. A whole life, a temporal entity, unfolded, so to speak, in God, where it is known as a whole. Sometimes we know people who've come very close to death say they saw their whole life flash before their eyes in great detail, yet in an instant, a flash, as if they are finally seeing themselves in God. As I researched, plotted and drafted my biographies, first of Kierkegaard and most recently of George Eliot, these lives struck me as surprisingly coherent in spite of their complexity. Of course, Kierkegaard and Eliot were remarkable people, deep thinkers, great writers. Yet my growing sense of the meaningfulness of their lives wasn't rooted in their immense accomplishments, their posthumous influence, or their historical importance. It lay rather in the possibility of drawing a narrative arc. Across many events and details, many different documents and points of view, I slowly discerned a shape, the way this particular path moved forward and looped back. It became possible to draw a line, in other words, to create a text that told their life story. Both Kierkegaard and Eliot themselves put life writing to philosophical use and stretched the boundaries of modern philosophy in the process. Of course, neither were biographers or autobiographers in any conventional sense, but They did take a singular human life, considered in its temporal narrative flow, as the subject of philosophical inquiry. Both were highly attentive to inner experience. Interestingly, marriage, such a decisive feature of a life's narrative arc, lies at the heart of both their work, a bubbling source of existential questions. Kierkegaard, who became an author after jilting his fiancée, Regina Olsen, wove fictionalized scenes from his own unhappy marriage plot into his texts. He was criticized for doing so, rather as today's writers of autofiction are criticized for using and betraying their closest relationships. So this central image here is a cartoon that was drawn of Kierkegaard in a satirical magazine, a bit like Private Eye, called The Corsair. And it's showing Kierkegaard riding on the back of this woman who is Regina Olsen, his poor jilted fiancée, and basically using her to further his literary career. And Joachim Garf, who's a great biographer of Kierkegaard, also has now written a biography of Regina called Regina's Way, Regina's Side of the Story. George Eliot's work is characterised by a combination of fact and fiction that permits us, I think, to read it as a form of life writing. As a critic, before she started to write novels, Eliot urged artists to the sacred task of truthfully portraying ordinary lives, then rose to this task herself. When she began to write stories, she based her characters on real people, so much so that some of these originals recognised themselves and objected. Her close attention to real life reflected her beliefs about the purpose of art, just as Kierkegaard's experiments in literary style expressed his existentialist principles. Eliot was inspired by Ruskin's realism. As she explained to readers of the Westminster Review, the doctrine that all truth and beauty are to be attained by a humble and faithful study of nature. She was striving for a beauty that went hand in hand with realism. Just before she wrote her first story, she set out her essential requirement for a novel, that it be beautiful. Her art also aimed for goodness, along with truth and beauty. She thought literature that rendered a life's emotional truth could move readers to deeper sympathy in their real-life encounters and relationships. As Cavallero emphasised, echoing Arendt, a human life has an exhibitive quality. It shows itself in the world. It is very difficult to disappear from view, to live an entirely hidden life, so much so that stories of people who really do disappear are intriguing. We are expressive beings by virtue of our embodiment, our speech, our gestures, our language, our actions, our creativity. This is why human lives are included in the class of entities that can be what the ancient Greeks called kalon, which is a quality of radiant beauty or nobility that belongs only to phenomena, things that appear. And biography is only possible because lives leave traces of their appearance. The biographer gathers up these manifestations and turns them into a story, narrates them as a whole, in order to bring into view the life's arc or pattern from beginning to end, which seems so hard to grasp or even to glimpse from the inside. In doing so, biography can uncover a life's kalon quality. Cavallero argued that life writing accomplishes a kind of revelation, and I have been trying to describe how a line of writing can follow and reveal, with some mixture of discovery and creativity, the line of a life. But there are counterpoints, of course, to this claim. While human lives tend to exhibit themselves, they are always partially hidden. It may even be that the most salient truths about a life, its deepest meanings, are guarded and dissembled. Kierkegaard had strong views about inwardness. He saw this as the site of our relationship to God, and therefore the most significant element of a human life. He also argued that inwardness is inaccessible to other people. Kierkegaard not only felt misunderstood, but believed that no one would ever understand him. As his biographer, I found myself in the rather paradoxical situation of wanting to explore his intense, generative inner life, bring it into view for the reader, while contending with his own claim that this was an impossible task. There's also, of course, the more prosaic and happenstance fact that much will be missing from any biography. Think of the texture of everyday experience, trips to the supermarket, a daily commute or school run, the stream of adverts on TV or public transport, all the small encounters and snatches of talk, heard or overheard, that saturate these experiences with meaning, but tend not to stick in our consciousness and certainly tend not to be recorded. The Proustian writer Annie Ernaux made such things luminous in her memoir Exteriors, a record of scraps of suburban life that only underscores how much goes unrecorded of an existence which Ernaux elsewhere described as singular, but also merged with the movements of a generation. It is rare for a biographer to gain access to their subject's quotidian experience, the flow of faces, atmospheres, and tones of voice that once filled their subjectivity. Most lives are mostly undocumented. Some documents that once existed may have been lost or destroyed or even buried, as is the case of the letters between George Eliot and her husband or partner, George Henry Lewis. The biographer must select from the sources that remain, make a path through the material, as I've said. A biography is not and should not be an exhaustive chronicle. Ironically, an excess of detail can thwart the attempt to grasp a life in its wholeness and reveal its singular shape. Finally, a life's diffusive quality is a counterpoint to its relentless linear arc. At the end of Middlemarch, George Eliot sums up the life of her heroine, Dorothea, by noting that the effect of her being on those around her was incalculably diffusive. Actually, Eliot is telling us that Dorothea's life cannot be summed up. It is incalculable. This novel dramatises the Spinozist principle that everything is interconnected, not just historically, but metaphysically. Each individual being is at once porous and self-transcending, constituted by its effects on others, as well as by the effects of others on itself. And Dorothea's effects will not be gathered up. No one can measure their significance or bind them into a whole. Surely this holds true of every life. Its diffuseness, by the way, is not at all at odds with its singularity. Each life makes a unique pattern of diffusions. But we can't trace this pattern, just as we can't trace the part of a wave that soaks into the sand as it crashes on the shore and withdraws into the sea. Even the word part feels inappropriately precise in this context. To know a whole life, we would have to know both the innumerable influences it's absorbed and its own reverberations, and this is impossible. Moreover, these diffusions often resist or elude writing with its strict linearity. Virginia Woolf inherited this artistic problem from George Eliot. She searched for new literary forms to express her diffused self. Diffuse has two distinct meanings, spreading over a relatively large area and lacking clarity or definition. Diffusion is not the same as fragmentation or incompleteness. A diffuse life is whole, but its wholeness is elusive. A work of biography might be begun, but in a certain sense it can never be concluded. Eliot seems to have grappled with this fact. When she reflected on the difficulty of ending a novel, she talked about how an ending is often unsatisfactory because it's just what she called a negation. It just stops. When she reflected on this difficulty of ending, she may have been thinking of the difficulty of completing the story of a life. She ends Middlemarch with a gesture of both revelation and concealment. Here are the novel's closing sentences in full. Talking about Dorothea, of course. Her finely touched spirit still had its fine issues, though they were not widely visible. Her full nature, like that river of which Cyrus broke the strength, spent itself in channels which had no great name on earth. But the effect of her being on those around her was incalculably diffusive, for the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. Dorothea has added to the growing good of the world, though it is impossible to say exactly how. Her acts are not widely visible, unhistoric, undocumented, and they end in doubled obscurity and unvisited tomb. Her life is literally hidden away, buried underground. What endures is its goodness, its kalon, quality, manifest only in the incalculably diffuse fact that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been. Eliot is here playing very delicately with an ethic of exemplarity, a Spinozist way of thinking about the good life that contrasts with the utilitarian and Kantian ethics ascendant during her own lifetime. Middlemarch began with a classic moral exemplar, St. Teresa, who reappears in its penultimate paragraph. The question of exemplarity is clearly in view across the novel. Not long ago, I discussed these closing sentences with Akil Bilgrami, a philosophy professor at Columbia. He told me that after finishing Middlemarch, he immediately went back to the beginning and read it again. In a series of essays on Gandhi, Bilgrami has analysed how moral exemplarity differs from a morality structured according to principles, rules or maxims in the tradition of Kant and Mill. Prominent in that paradigm are concepts of obligation, violation and transgression. These concepts generate a culture of moral criticism that Gandhi believed fosters violence. By contrast, exemplarity can give rise to disappointment, the great theme of Middlemarch, and also to hope, the counterpart of disappointment. In order to be exemplary, an action or a life must be visible to others. Hannah Arendt pointed out that the Greeks called heroes andres epiphanes, men who are fully manifest. Gandhi, like St. Teresa, is a powerful exemplar in this respect, a very public figure. The 19th century was dominated by notions of great men, epitomised by Carlisle's On Heroes, Hero Worship and the Heroic in History, that's 1841, Comte's positivist calendar with its months named after all these great men of history, and then Emerson's representative men in 1850. So the positivist calendar was 1849. Their spirit diffuses itself, wrote Emerson. This is the key to the power of the greatest men. So this is what Eliot was dealing with during her 20s, a period of intense philosophical apprenticeship. Carlisle, Comte and Emerson were all formative influences for her, though she would eventually smash their patriarchal ideal. While Nietzsche, for all his iconoclastic hammering, left this ideal intact and fitted his own life and work to its mould, Middlemarch subverts it in a double way by contemplating a female exemplar, St. Teresa, and by refracting her exemplarity through another woman's unhistoric life. Eliot was interested in the moral power of ordinary lives like Dorothea's, whose effects are not widely visible, though nevertheless diffuse. Such lives can be rendered visible by art. In Fear and Trembling, a book about the problematic idea that Abraham should be followed as an exemplar, Kierkegaard argues that even a celebrated hero such as Abraham needs his poet to keep him visible in the world. A poet is someone who is exceptionally sensitive to beauty in the holistic sense conveyed by this Greek word kalon, and exceptionally skilled at discerning and transmitting this beauty in writing. Unless poets tell their stories, exemplars will fade from view and eventually be forgotten. These stories must be compelling to keep their exemplary power alive through repetition. Kierkegaard's reflections on the hero and the poet evoke pairings such as Socrates and his poet, Plato, Jesus and the Gospel writers, as well as that most troubling hero, Abraham, and Kierkegaard, his troubled poet. Some feminist readers have criticised George Eliot for depicting obscure wives and mothers, such as Dorothea, rather than allowing her female heroines to have extraordinary lives like her own. Yet this was a philosophical choice rooted in a radical ethics of exemplarity and committed to exploring the disappointment and the hope this entails. Eliot was a poet of ordinary goodness, a gospel writer of hidden lives. Writing Dorothea's story rescues her from oblivion and bears witness to the fact that the world is better, more beautiful, more calon for this rather unremarkable life, having moved through it. Similarly, we are better for having read the book. The qualities of beauty and goodness discerned in Dorothea's life also shine in the words chosen to convey the significance of that life. Just as a life leaves its trace, having passed through the world, so a book leaves its trace in us. Something beautiful has passed through our own inner life. These closing lines of Middlemarch, now among the most famous passages in English literature, seem to be about two things at once: life and writing. Eliot is reflecting on Dorothea's life and also on her own search for the truth, beauty, and goodness of a human life. This search is philosophical, artistic, and in a certain sense religious. It is this threefold meaning that life writing can seek to glimpse and to reveal. Is this the aim of all writing? Is it the arc of life itself? I'm reminded again of being 3 or 4 years old, pencil in hand, trying to get my letters right, trying to make them look nice, trying to copy my mother. Now I wonder if that little girl was already striving for beauty, truth, and goodness before she knew how to write the words. Thank you.
That was completely fascinating, and it's not often that we have a combination of philosophy with life writing here at Occleve, so that's a really interesting way to think about it. So I want to take you back to your alphabet.
Oh, yes.
It reminded me, oddly, of the philosopher Mr. Ramsay in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, trying to reach R. So he's gone through all the letters of the alphabet, which is her metaphor for the philosopher trying to think his way through the harder and harder and harder problems. But he can't get to R. He's constantly urging himself on and saying, on then, on to R. And his whole life is subsumed with this sort of deep anxiety about not being able to get just that bit further in his thinking process. This made me think that there is a concept of understanding a whole life. In the period, sort of roughly 19th, early 20th, I mean, Mr. Ramsay, loosely or strongly based on Leslie Stephen, her father is a 19th century intellectual, which is a concept of life which has to do with determined endeavour, trying to get somewhere. It's extremely linear. Pushing yourself as far as you can go, being full of ambition, wanting to get things right that you are set on this earth to do. This is very different from the kinds of more diffusive or non-linear ways of thinking about the shape of the whole life that you've been talking about. But do you think that George Eliot, in her time, shared that view? Because when I think of her novels, I think you're right, they're a lot about disappointment and they're a lot about failure. We can come back to that. But they are also tremendously much about effort and will and needing to go forward with the task that has been set you. And I wondered whether you think that might define partly her way of thinking about a whole life or the shape of a life.
Well, I do think that she was very, very ambitious woman, and that was really something that became so striking to me as I wrote that biography. I was so struck by her ambition and also by her difficulty in confessing to that ambition, and so it became, I guess, subverted in some ways. The concept of vocation, which is perhaps another way of naming what you're describing, I think was also important. It was a concept she played with and thought through. And of course, that's part of her culture. That's part of her heritage. It's a Christian heritage. It's also part of her sort of upbringing. So of course that's there. And at the same time, I think she's deeply influenced by this more Spinozist vision of a sort of spreading, diffusing, porous life. So both are in play.
Yes, but when you say that, if I can push back, it makes her seem more mystical and more all-embracing than I feel her view of life is when I read the books. Parce, the wonderful ending of Dorothea. but there is so much in the books about struggle and endeavour and will and thwarted wills and the need to, so I suppose what I'm sort of positioning myself against this idea of a diffusive, mystical kind of George Eliot.
Well, I don't really see the two as incompatible.
Okay.
They're both really Spinoza's actually, because Spinoza talks a lot about what he calls this conatus, which is the will. So every person has this sort of desire to persist in existence. That's a kind of life force that not just every person, but everything has. So it's like we're all these centres of power, and we're sort of pushing through, and we're striving on the one hand, and yet we're not sort of bounded selves. So that very striving is going to create the diffuse effects.
Okay, that's very cunning.
And also, I think one of the things that becomes interesting in George, the arc of George Eliot's life is, very naturally, once she had achieved everything that she set out to achieve, she started to think a lot about her afterlife, her legacy, her posthumous legacy, and she became very focused on that. So in a sense, she's starting to think about her own diffusion while she's living, and how her own existence is going to. Of course, that's a completely unknown thing, but it's something that she, I think, became very conscious of as she was conscious of her mortality. So thinking of the ending of her life, but also of the diffusion of her life, or the possible forgetting and burying of the life. I think that's all in play.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there are some philosophers, and one or two of them have been here in the past, who don't really credit the idea of a identity or a selfhood, or I'm thinking of Galen Strawson, who has been here, putting all the life writers' backs up by saying, you can't do this. There's no such thing as a whole or fixed identity. I'm sort of assuming, but you'll put me right if I've got this wrong, that you do think that there is such a thing as a whole life that can be grasped and described, and that leads me to the question of the quite complicated title of this book on George Eliot, which has, as it were, within it two concepts of how to describe or make us understand this life. One is the phrase "double life." So on the cover, I think this is the American edition.
That's the UK edition.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. You've got the marriage question, like a banner across the figure. And then down the side, which I really liked, you've got George Eliot's double life. So there are two concepts in play as to how to make us grasp this life, or your approach to this life. Could you say a bit more, since the talk has not been so much about the writing of the biography, about how you came to pick on those two things?
Well, so the title of the book is The Marriage Question. That was always the title, went from conception to birth, and that came from. It sort of followed on from the book on Kierkegaard, because in writing his life, I've talked about him breaking off his engagement to his fiancée. So in his case, what we could call the marriage question was really decisive, not just for that particular phase of his life, but for his life as a whole, actually. So he decided not to get married. He broke off the engagement. He became a writer. And then in his writing, he kept circling back to the question of marriage. So in his case, sort of not marrying really defined the shape of his life and his thinking. So by the end of writing that book, I was really interested in sort of just how much of an existential question marriage was for him. And then, my next project was George Eliot's translation of Spinoza, and I was obviously reading a lot about George Eliot and reading several biographies, and I thought, the marriage question is completely decisive for her life too. In her case, of course, the story is different. It's about her not marrying, but, having this marriage and the way she tries to almost redefine marriage.
You better explain,
Yes.
just in case there's anyone in the room who
Yeah,
doesn't know that story.
so she basically got together with George Henry Lewis, who was married to somebody else, but sort of separated from his wife. So Eliot and Lewis couldn't marry, so they were sort of life partners. They lived openly as a couple, which was very unusual for a non-married couple. But interestingly, they called the relationship a marriage, and she wanted to be called Mrs. Lewis, and so she did want to frame the relationship as a marriage, even though it wasn't a legal marriage. And so she talked about the experience of marriage as opposed to the legal status. And I found that really interesting. So
one of the things that you are very engaged with in the book, and which is deeply interesting to anyone who reads George Eliot, is that this marriage, which couldn't be legal and therefore was a source of great scandal and cut her off from society, was a lifelong devoted working partnership, and yet in her novels and stories, as you make wonderfully clear, there are some really horrific marriages in the books. If you think of Gwendolen and Grandcourt in Daniel Deronda, or poor old Romola and her awful husband Titus. Tito. Sorry. I think of his time in Romola.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some truly ghastly things going on in these marriages, and you know, I was waiting with sort of bated breath while I was reading your book to think, are you going to do that thing of saying, well, actually, this relationship with George Henry Lewis, who could be a really annoying person, has sort of deep, dark, awful underbelly, and that's what's coming out in the novels, and you don't do that quite, do you? But there's clearly something going on there.
Yes, well, I do think, just to also add that, so the phrase double life is George Eliot's phrase, so that's one of the ways she describes the relationship.
Okay. Sorry,
just to come back to that, yes, I just remembered. So she talks about this double life when she's writing to a friend about actually quite early in the relationship, sort of honeymoon period. That relationship has tended to be quite idealised and romanticised, I think, by other biographers, based on the couple's own very idealised portrayals of it. So they always described themselves as sort of blissfully happy, perfect love. You know, it was all so kind of, to me, unrealistically wonderful, because I think
we're quite allowed to believe that.
I just think no relationship is like that. So it's not that I think their relationship was particularly bad, but of course there's going to be some sort of shadows in any long-term partnership. They were together for 24 years. And there are hints of those shadows, even though they don't really talk about their marital problems. So it's not a kind of expose of, the marriage was really terrible, but it is, I was trying to sort of, I guess, certainly call into question the very idealised image they portrayed themselves, and they had every reason to portray it as a sort of defence against all the criticism they were getting for their relationship, and a sort of defiance that this relationship will be a great success, as a kind of defiance, I think, against all the judgment she in particular faced.
Where do you think that profound darkness comes from in Georgia? I mean, you've been thinking about the darkness in Kierkegaard and a kind of deep depression within the life of Kierkegaard. Yes. And you make very clear in your book on George Eliot that there are terrible phases of depression, and when one reads the novels and the stories, what I perhaps most remember about Eliot when I'm thinking back on the books is grief. Senses of grief, loss, pain, terrible sense of having missed what you most wanted to do or have in life. Where do you cite that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I came to think that her loss of her mother was really decisive. So her mother died when she was 16, but actually sort of withdrew into illness when she was very young indeed. So in a sense, there was a very, very early experience of a kind of loss of her, sort of emotional loss of her mother, that she did reflect on sort of later in life. So my own sense. And of course, this is partly my own experience and my own empathy coming in, but I think that experience of loss and grief was so formative for her that it kind of coloured her inner life, really, her sort of her relationship with the world. And then I think she was really relatively. She spent quite a lot of the first sort of 30-odd years of her life feeling frustrated and feeling this great ambition to write a great work of philosophy or a great work of art. And, she spent a lot of time not doing that, basically, and not being married and not being chosen. So I think she really had enough time to have quite a deep experience of failure and disappointment, even though, of course, she completely turned it around in the last...
And is it your contention that the relationship with Lewis, who was enormously enabling to her, do you think that he somehow unlocked those possibilities that she had not quite... I mean, she'd obviously already started to be a writer.
Yes.
She hadn't started to be a novelist before she was with him.
No, that's right. So I think it's very difficult to imagine her becoming George Eliot without that relationship. It does seem that it's this idea of interdependence that I was really interested in, particularly against the, I think, quite a simplistic ideal of the modern independent woman, the autonomous woman, as if that's what we're supposed to be. And I don't really sort of believe in that ideal. I think that we are interconnected and interdependent, and I think that's her story is a really nice example of that, because we see it in the life story, but it's also there in the philosophy, the Spinoza's philosophy and other ideas that she's exploring. So I think it's there in the life and in the thought.
In her philosophy of life, is there not always also a very strong sense, and I don't know if it's rooted in evangelical faith, which she moved through and away from, as it were, but a strong sense that suffering is necessary, and that to, as it were, share, not just feel our own suffering and pain in our own personal lives, whatever it may be, but to have some sense of being able to share, go beyond the boundaries of the self, and to share the world's suffering or the suffering of people around one. Is that an integral, crucial part of what she's doing in the work and in her life?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, that's literally what sympathy means.
Sympathy.
Yes, so she had this concept of sympathy, which is quite similar to what our concept of empathy, but it's basically suffering with others. I mean, literally, that's what the word means from the Greek. So absolutely. And that idea of feeling with somebody, that's another idea that it's dramatised in Middlemarch near the end, where Dorothea and Celia are talking about... Celia's really curious about how Dorothea... I hope this isn't a spoiler, but how Dorothea got together with Will Ladislaw, and she's like, I can't think how it happened. And Dorothea says something like, oh, you would have to feel with me, or you would never understand.
Yes, it's a wonderful moment in that relationship.
Beautiful moment. I love their relationship. So this idea of feeling with another person is, I think, itself an example of... really kind of, in a way, dissolving the boundaries of the self. If you can feel with somebody, where do you end and where do they begin? And I think that's an experience. We can talk about that in a very on a very metaphysical level, which Spinoza does. But I think George Eliot's exploring it in a much more experiential and accessible.
But does she sort of get the idea from Spinoza, or is that putting it a bit too?
I don't know. I mean. When I edited her translation of Spinoza, I wanted to sort of downplay the idea that she was really Spinoza's, because I didn't want to just sort of reduce her work to Spinozism. So, and of course, she read lots of different philosophers, and she had her own thoughts. It wasn't just about what she took from other people. But actually, I'm increasingly convinced that she was just sort of very, very deeply Spinozist. But that doesn't just mean that she took his ideas. It's also that those ideas resonated with her. I mean, I'm Spinozist too. Like when I studied philosophy as an undergraduate, I just got really into Spinoza, and that's because there was a part of me that kind of already felt that, and then you encounter a philosophy that sort of makes sense to you. So it's not, yeah. So I think we can maybe think that there was, perhaps it resonated with her already, but it articulated. I think
in your own biographical practice, life writing practice, I was very fascinated and admiring of the fact in your book that you don't pass judgment on her or on the behaviour of others. I'll quote a couple of sentences from your book on Eliot. You say, "It is not at all obvious that we are entitled to make moral judgments about these people whose inner lives we only glimpse from afar." That's one. And another quote, "I will not try to weigh up these shared lives according to some scale of good and bad, right and wrong." So this is a very clear biographical philosophy, and it is one, I may say, not shared by all biographers. I've read plenty of biographies, and I'm sure everybody in this room has, where the biographer is very eager to apportion blame or to shame someone. You know, someone's going to come off badly in this story, and usually it's not the hero or the heroine, it's their kind of adversary, their husband or wife, as it might be. So we're all quite used to biographical writing in which that refusal to pass judgment is not maintained. So was it hard to maintain that sense of, you know, I'm not going to judge these people?
No, it wasn't hard to maintain. In fact, I felt like with the Kierkegaard biography, I think both Kierkegaard and George Eliot were subjects who had a really deep and strong experience of being judged by other people. You know, in Kierkegaard's case, his engagement crisis, everyone was judging him, and a lot of his philosophical thinking was sort of about that, like what it is to be a human being in the world. You're constantly subject to judgment, but then he had this idea that in the relationship to God, there was a kind of freedom from that, the judgment of other human beings. So it was sort of liberating in a way. And of course, George Eliot had this experience, very intense experience of being judged. So I think actually for both of them, that was a really striking part of their life story. And Eliot's very critical of sort of moral, even though she's sometimes seen as a moralist, she's also very critical of moralising authors who punish their villains and reward their sort of heroines and heroes. So I think it comes quite naturally to me, and that's one of the reasons why I like both those writers, because they're not moralising, and I don't like moralising. And I also, as a reader, don't really like being bossed about by the author and told what to think and feel. So I much prefer, and sort of having had that experience myself and not really liking it, I want to sort of course, give the reader the information and let them reach their own. So it's partly about letting them reach their own conclusions, but I also would want to question that judging is the thing we're here to do at all. So it's a sort of twofold thing. One is let people judge for themselves, but then also question, well, why do we have to judge?
This is a very good note.
How should we judge?
This is a very good note for practicing or would-be biographers. Don't be bossy. I think that's a good takeaway, as they say. I've got one more question, and I'm going to open this out because I'm sure there are lots of other people with questions. I got the feeling, and I'm very interested in this because biography takes a long time to do, and sometimes you change your relationship with your subject while you're doing it, or pieces of information come up which you hadn't expected, and so it's a process. And many of us in this room know about that. I got the feeling that you were, as it were, evolving your feeling, is that too soft a word? Your feeling about the work or your feeling about her as you did this work, and that you didn't have it all cut and dried at the beginning. Is that right, or am I wrong about it?
Was there a particular sort of direction or just a general feeling of...
No, I just got this, well, it's a diffusive, in the good sense of exploration, and the fact that you were... That there was some motion going on in your evolving sense of her as you wrote the book.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true, because I mean, as I was mentioning earlier, I'm not a George Eliot scholar. I did write the biography of Kierkegaard, having written a PhD on Kierkegaard, written like 3 other books on Kierkegaard. So I came to that biography really already knowing a lot about his thought and about his life. With the George Eliot, I had read, I'd researched the Spinoza translation and written the introduction, so I'd read probably 3 biographies of her, and I'd read, I think, all her novels, or most of her novels by that point. But I was a sort of amateur reader. I was just sort of someone who liked George Eliot and found her really interesting, and was obviously, when I did the Spinoza translation, I realised how much she was interested in philosophy, and it really opened up all the philosophical influences. So by the time I'd finished that translation, I was kind of very, very interested in George Eliot and wanted to write about her, but also very daunted because I wasn't an expert, I wasn't a literary scholar. And the way I had sort of planned out the book at the beginning with that each chapter, it begins with the beginning of their relationship, with them going off together, and then ends at the end of her life. So it's not a sort of cradle to grave book, it's more focused on the period of their relationship. Although, of course, I do go back to look at the childhood at various points. So I had my themes and my chapters planned out, but then I really wrote it one chapter at a time. So I would read the novel and read various portion of the various biographies, the letters. I sort of read all the material relating to that chapter and then write the chapter, and then I'd sort of start again. Yes. And that made it manageable. I think otherwise I would have been really overwhelmed by material. So even though I knew what my kind of themes were, I did certainly evolve as I went along and was doing a lot of the discovery. So obviously I'd read the biography, so I kind of obviously knew her life story, but then getting deeper into the material as I went and themes emerging. And then I'm sure I would have gone back and it's not like I didn't go back and work again on earlier chapters, but that's the way I wrote the book.
It's a very interesting account of process, and everybody does it differently, and that's very fascinating. So it's almost like scenes from a life. Yes, now we have a mic that is ready to be rushed around the room, and I'm sure there will be people who want to ask questions, whether it be on Kierkegaard or Spinoza or George Eliot or life writing or anything in that range. Yes, here. Thank you. Thank you.
So just about the judgment, you said something interesting, that too detailed a biography is not interesting. But that also implies then you're selecting from this whole array, and in that there must be some implicit judgment about what you actually are going to choose. So the judgment seems to me it's sort of your duty to do, isn't it?
Yeah. That's yes, of course. Yeah, and I think selecting is a big part of writing a biography, is deciding what to put in. I should add that as a biographer, it's really great to have those exhaustive chronicle type books to work with, because as a biography, I want to know everything. But as a reader of biography, like I'm reading this big biography of Proust at the moment, the Tadier.
The Jean-Yves Tadier.
Yeah, and it's great, but I'm sort of a bit mired in it. It's so, so that's an example of a book that's just, got sort of so much in it, and it's difficult to sort of see the wood for the trees a bit.
You do get, it's very interesting because we all think about this selection judgment thing all the time, but you do get a lot of the quotidian in the George Eliot book. I love the pictures that keep coming up of Lewis and George Eliot like two owls, sort of working away and then going for a walk and then, reading to each other and then going to sleep and then getting up and working. So I love all that kind of daily stuff. And you do get that.
Yeah. I think it's partly when you discern a theme. So say, for example, there's a theme of sort of ambition, and then I might find just one quotation that really sort of sums up that theme. So it's sort of representative. So it's sort of figuring out what is salient and then finding something that's representative rather than having all of it there.
Not using 10 quotes.
Exactly, yes,
right.
and it's not necessary, especially if I didn't want to write a huge book, because I personally quite like relatively short books as a reader. But no, I think that's a really important point, that your point about the judgment is happening anyway, so why not be a bit more explicit about it rather than sort of pretending you're not there. I think that's really important. And of course, some biographers make the decision to be very present to the reader, to talk about themselves, to talk about their process, to be kind of on stage. And I was very off stage with the Kierkegaard biography, and I was criticised for it by some people liked that, and other people wanted me to come in and be a bit more, sort of interfere a bit more and make more judgments and sort of say, oh, isn't Kierkegaard annoying, or isn't Kierkegaard being difficult here, or whatever. And I think with the George Eliot book, and also partly through sort of being with her voice, I mean, she sometimes turns to the reader and addresses the reader. So I do a little bit of that, and kind of, but not in a judgy way, but in a kind of maybe a bit more making some kind of point or reflecting, a bit like the ones you read out, where that's me talking to the reader.
Yep.
Okay. Yes, but I think it's, of course you're always there making your judgments. And then it's the case of how do you transmit that to the reader? Yeah, it's very delicate, I think.
Other questions?
There was one at the front.
Oh, Sally. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I'd like to go back to your beginning, really, and I'll give you an anecdote of my own learning to write.
Oh, yes.
I was learning to do joined-up writing for the first time, and I proudly showed it to my father, who gently pointed out that you don't join all the words as well together. And I thought thinking about it, it's quite interesting, because language has all these gaps.
Yeah.
It's not a joined-up whole.
Yeah.
And so I was then thinking about your whole notion about a whole life. And taking the Middlemarch and the diffusion and the movement of the self beyond the grave. Yeah. That actually a lot of the truths that the statements you started with, you've unpicked. In that a life, what George Eliot is suggesting is that a life isn't temporally bound. It's not sort of a beginning and an end. It's something that flows through. And then you were talking about truths, and I just couldn't work out quite what a truth in a biography would be. Because if we agree that it's all about perspective, what you choose, that everything is going to be, you've only got access to a very small fraction of a life. What would a truth be?
Yes, good question. So just on the first point about the intermittencies and the rhythm, as you say, I think I said that in the talk, that there are these, a text has a rhythm, there's a gaps between the words, as you say, and life is also like that. Like there's sleeping and waking, and there's breathing, and there's all these rhythms in life too, and lapses of attention, and then so yes, life is of course like that. But with the concept of a whole life, there's also a kind of brute objectivity to it. The fact that this life was born and died, and is even if the person's asleep or not being observed, that sort of body is there in space and time, and that's something that I think is an intuitive truth, really, about what it is to be a person, what it is to exist. You're there, and then you're not there. And of course, in subjective experience, there's all sorts of intermittencies, but nevertheless, the life, you could say, is there. And in theory, you could imagine someone who's following someone around and tracing them, or you could track somebody on their phone. So there is this objectivity to it. And at the same time, there's the rhythm and the intermittencies. And I suppose I'm saying that in comparing it to a text, a book is like that too. It's there on the shelf, but it's also got this kind of rhythm and temporality. Oh gosh, what was... Oh yes, and then truth. Yeah. Well, so I'm thinking about the truth of the life as sort of threefold. And and that corresponds to what I take to be a sort of threefold nature of biographical writing, which is, on the one hand, there's a sort of empirical, historical element to it. There are facts that you can get right or wrong as a biographer. Then there's a more kind of creative and artistic aspect to writing a biography, where you're interpreting and you're making artistic decisions and you're shaping a narrative and so on. And then there's the more philosophical level, and the kinds of philosophical questions that I raised about, sort of freedom and identity and what the self is, and perhaps obviously I'm a philosopher who wrote biographies, so I'm particularly kind of attuned to those sort of those questions as well. So I see biography as something that is, on the one hand, it's a kind of art, it's creative, it's also empirical, it's a more kind of sciencey thing in a way, a kind of history, and it's philosophical. And I would want to say that truth is also to be found in those three registers. That's not to say it's discoverable, but that's what you're pursuing. You're in pursuit of truth, I think, as a biographer, just as a philosher, you're in pursuit of truth.
I liked your image of the funeral procession, where the person's gone, and all the different people who were there following the cortege, as it were, have their own version of that person. It reminded me, actually, in a very lively life scene, of the scene in Middlemarch, where the gentry are looking out of the window and seeing, various members of the Middlemarch Society going past, congregating for a particular event. And we know those people already in the story. And some of the people looking out of the window don't know them very well. And they identify them in ways which give you a slight shock, because they're giving you a sort of slightly different perspective on those people who you sort of feel, oh no, but I can tell you more about them, because you already saw them. So I think it's partly, truth is in that multifaceted conjunction of witnesses and different people circling around the subject at different times of their life.
Just also to say, as a biographer, and also just as a person, I'm really interested in what my subject is feeling. That's what I really want to know. So what's Kierkegaard actually? He's sort of saying something, but the idea that I think what's really going on here is he's actually really disappointed, and he's not saying that, but that. So there's an emotional truth, or what's George Eliot feeling, and that's of course elusive, but it's also so important to me in telling the story. I want to know what she's feeling.
Okay. Well, what I'm feeling,
emotional truth,
is that I've had a very splendid and wonderful time with beauty, goodness and truth, and thinking about meanings of biography and meanings of lives. And I'm really appreciative, as I think we all are, of the kind of generous and candid and open, thoughtful way that you've led us through these very complicated paths. What I'm also feeling is it would be really nice to have a drink. So please do join us in the cafe. Thank you all for coming to the Life Writing Centre to Occlu. Some of you have obviously been here before, some of you I think haven't. So do keep following us on our website, finding out what we have to offer, and come back and visit us again. Thank you all so much, and thank you so much, Clare.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
That's Sally Shuttleworth.
Yes, I realise actually, I recognise her.
It was great. That's great.
I hope it wasn't too.